The name of the course is Freedom on the Edge, and in it we'll deal with some defining moments when freedom has been brought to the edge in the American experience. The edge is the precipice we seem to be perpetually on in this country, constantly in danger of falling off and losing our hard-fought and hard-won freedoms. Yet somehow we've survived, and we're still up there balancing. But Lord knows, we've been awfully close to falling off many times. This course will deal with only some of the experiences that have brought us close, and hopefully with some of the factors that have allowed us to regain our balance. There have, of course, been many such experiences in our history, and many other than those that I've selected to deal with in the limited time available to us here. I'm sure you'll think of many. If this course serves to heighten your attention, your awareness of these experiences in our history, both past and current, I feel it will have served its purpose admirably well. Let me emphasize this. I can't emphasize it too much. There are no absolutes here. My intention here is merely to heighten your awareness, not only of the issues we've faced, but of the background in this country which has conditioned our approach to those issues, especially in times of crisis. It's my hope that this philosophical, structural, and historical perspective will in some small way be of aid to you as you consider the complex issues such as the delicate balancing of freedom and security which we all face. Here's a brief outline of what we'll cover. We'll begin our consideration today with an examination of some of the philosophical and structural foundations of our freedom, including the role of the Enlightenment thinking and other influences underlying the creation of our Declaration of Independence. We'll go on to the enactment of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights by men who have become known as our founding fathers, men whose names grace more street signs, public squares, and post office addresses than any in the nation. We'll consider their faith in the dignity of man, but we'll also examine the very practical wisdom concerning man's less than angelic propensities, which were built into our Constitution and which have led, among other things, to a very carefully structured balance of powers. Next week, we'll learn how this very Bill of Rights was virtually abolished in 1798 by the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were adopted by a Congress and signed into law by an executive populated by many of the very men who'd put their lives on the line to gain freedom from Great Britain and who'd fashioned that very Bill of Rights. We will examine what excesses this resulted in and how we finally backed away from this precipice under Jefferson in the early 1800s. In that same session next week, we'll also consider freedom on the edge in the Civil War. The Civil War, of course, was a period of great emancipation. Our nation was finally freed, at least officially, from the eternal scourge of slavery, which had haunted it and given the lie to many of the great principles enunciated in the Bill of Rights. Freed at last, at least formally, from the irreconcilable paradoxes of the Dred Scott decision, but at what price to the doctrine of habeas corpus and to the separation of powers. Our second session then will deal with the phenomenon of the suspension of habeas corpus and how our nation struggled with accommodating it and remaining free. As you are no doubt painfully aware, suspension of habeas corpus in other societies has been and remains a bedrock of despotism. We will return to this theme in later sessions as well, and we'll consider this issue in depth in our sixth and final session dealing with the current terrorist crisis. We'll move on in our third session to examine the phenomenon of populism. Now, populism, as you know, was a movement born in the desperation of the agrarian community in the latter half of the 19th century, and out of its inability to fathom the forces behind the severe rural depression that plagued that period. We'll continue in that same session to explore ramifications of that movement in the 30s. And such demagogic 20th century charismatics as Huey Long and Father Charles Coughlin, as well as in Martin Dies and the genesis of the House Un-American Activities Committee. We'll even find traces of the movement as late as a decade later during the McCarthy era. In that third session, we'll also consider the curious but deadly transformation of left-seeming phenomenon in the 30s into right-wing extremism. And we'll explore as well the response of the right to many of the intellectual, artistic, and political movements of the 30s, which laid the groundwork for the witch hunts of the late 40s and 50s. Our fourth session will deal with Harry S. Truman and the attack on his administration by three Macs: McCarthy, MacArthur, and McCarran. Truman era is one which will confound biographers and political scientists for ages to come. In many ways, this plain-spoken, humble, God-fearing man from Missouri was a great leader. He was certainly responsible for many of the most far-reaching decisions of this century: dropping the bomb, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, and our engagements in Korea. But he was a man who, with very few exceptions, was very unpopular during his presidency. We'll examine how this unpopularity and the weakness of the presidency during the majority of his term, coupled with a ferocious Republican onslaught, born out of years of powerless frustration, actually emboldened McCarthy's anti-communist witch hunt in 1951 and MacArthur's fateful decision to drive beyond the 38th parallel to the North Korean border, to the Yalu. Again, situations which brought us dangerously close to the edge. And we'll examine how we survived it. Although today we still have many casualties, I'm sure you know many, wounded both mentally and physically from these episodes. All this in our fourth session. Now in the fifth session, we'll turn to the Nixon White House. Another enigma: the plumbers, the Pentagon Papers, and finally Watergate. Were we dangling on the precipice here? We had an overpowered executive which had arrogated to itself the abolition of basic civil rights, in particular the right to privacy, bypassing the legislative and judiciary branches in ways almost unparalleled in our history. The period was strangely reminiscent in many ways of the atmosphere surrounding the passage and enforcement of the Alien and Sedition Acts, where the executive was prosecutor, enforcer, judge, and jury. But ironically, it was strangely reminiscent as well of the atmosphere of reverse power imbalance surrounding Truman's weakened executive branch in the late 40s and early 50s, and the communist witch hunts and the heightened military power, which ensued out of an aberration of heightened power in the legislative branch. Our delicate balance then is like a teeter-totter, can fall both ways if the carefully fashioned balance is not kept. Finally, in our sixth and final session, we'll deal with the fallout from September 11th. We'll focus in particular on the executive order of November 13th, 2001, creating military tribunals with particular emphasis on the suspension of habeas corpus and the potential creation of an underclass. We'll examine and compare the Quirin and Yamashita cases, creating military tribunals during the Second World War. We'll try to place in perspective other executive orders in our history which have created an underclass and deprived the members of that class of the remedy of habeas corpus to test the validity of their detention. This, our final session, will then also consider the Palmer raids of 1920, the Japanese-American internments of 1940, which I know we have experts in this room, and certain strangely parallel illustrative happenings in Vichy France at the same time in our history. I began preparing the series in the summer of 2001, before the happenings of September 11th. As I thought through the topic, it became readily apparent that there are no absolutes here. But the more I read and the more I prepared, the more I began to notice certain factors that kept recurring throughout our history when freedom was brought to the edge. Soon they appeared to recur with a degree of regularity that I could no longer ignore. The events of September 11th, 2001 required me to reconsider the topic within the framework of a new perspective, that of a free country facing the prospect of homeland terror. And again, no absolutes, but the same factors kept reoccurring. One is crisis, the exigencies of severe economic depression, the fact of war, the threat of invasion, threat of terror. These often, if not invariably, seem to accompany threats to our freedoms. Another factor is xenophobia. By this, I mean not only fear of persons from foreign nations, but also fear of races, religions, and even of political or social views that appear different, out of the mainstream at any particular time in history. The appearance of this factor in many of its malevolent guises likewise seems to accompany threats to our freedom. A third theme, which seems to keep cropping up, is one we've already alluded to, That is, the occurrence of an imbalance in the balance of powers between the three branches of government established in the Constitution. That balance has been dangerously imperiled at various times in our history by the inordinate empowerment or the inordinate weakness of any one branch. This phenomenon is also accompanied by a threat to our freedom. Now, the fourth and final theme is not quite so obvious. I call it the image of man, for lack of a better descriptive phrase. The image of man shared by persons in positions of authority in this country must be a balanced one. If it is not, trouble flows. Our founding fathers built the foundations of this nation on dual cornerstones. One was an abiding faith in the dignity and worth of each individual soul. The second was a healthy respect for man's inclination to dominate. For as Thomas Jefferson wisely observed, the natural process is for liberty to yield and for government to gain ground. Persons in position of authority must, of course, be practical. They must be fully cognizant at all times of the inevitable flaws in human nature. But when the image of man, shared by persons in power, is skewed too far in another direction, when persons so empowered, for whatever reason, be it life experience or innate character, lose a certain awe, wonder, and respect for the sanctity of life, and they become cynical, demeaning, and lose sight of the worth and dignity of the individual soul, freedom invariably is brought to the edge. Well, what then were these philosophical and structural foundations of which I speak? The famous 19th century novelist Dickens wrote a novel we probably all read in high school called The Tale of Two Cities. And it begins with a description which eloquently describes the times we're dealing with here, the latter half of the 18th century, time of the Declaration of Independence. It goes as follows. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the year of our Lord, 1775. Dickens, of course, is referring to France and England, and the two cities in his tale being, of course, London and Paris. But he might as well have been referring to our 13 colonies, because it was the best of times, Declaration of Independence. It was the age of enlightenment. It was the age of the influence of Enlightenment thinking on our founding fathers. It was the age of reason. And it was the age that brought us the Declaration of Independence. Now, where did the image of the individual that led to this document come from? Who were the men who created the Declaration? What was the cultural background? What were the events in their lives and the lives of their contemporaries that led finally to this revolutionary document? I'd like to briefly consider three such men. Two were members of the committee that forged the document. They're household names today. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. The third, George Mason of Virginia, was not on the committee and may not be well known to many of us. But the influence of Mason's thinking on the document was profound. First, a word about the historical background leading to the appointment of the committee to adopt the Declaration. An eminent Catholic theologian and historian, Michael Novak of the American Enterprise Institute, recently pointed out that a number of the founders considered colonists a second Israel, freeing themselves from the bonds of British oppression as the Israelites had freed themselves from the bondage of the Egyptian pharaohs. You recall that at first the Israelites resisted Moses' attempts to lead them out of Egypt. Well, the First and Second Continental Congresses of 1774 and 1775 convened at Philadelphia to express their grievances against the crown, but not to demand independence. Notwithstanding the outbreak of war at Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, and the Battle of Bunker Hill, which followed shortly thereafter, the delegates to the Second Continental Congress, which convened in Philadelphia on May 10, 1775, incredible as it may seem, echoing the wishes of their constituents, still steadfastly denied that they wanted to found a new empire. No mention was yet made of independence in their petition to the Crown for relief, this notwithstanding that George Washington had already taken command of the ragtag militias, which were fighting the British regulars in the field. But John Adams did not share this supine attitude. I hope many of you have read McCullough's biography of Adams. It's a marvelous piece of work. Well, who was Adams and what made him tick? David McCullough begins his dramatic biography of Adams with a chapter entitled The Road to Philadelphia. and immediately defines the character of the man as he describes him in January 1776 in these words. In the cold, nearly colorless light of a New England winter, two men on horseback traveled the coast road below Boston. A foot or more of snow covered the landscape, the remnants of a Christmas storm that had blanketed Massachusetts from one end of the province to the other. Beneath the snow, after 2 weeks of severe cold, the ground was frozen solid to a depth of 2 feet. Packed ice in the road, ruts as hard as iron, made the going hazardous, and the riders mindful of the horses kept at a walk. Well, one of these men, of course, was Adams. McCullough relates that he was around 5'7", verging on the portly, with the hands of a man accustomed to pruning his own trees, cutting his own hay, splitting his own firewood. Adams was a farmer, came from a family of farmers. He would remain an active farmer to the day he died, July 4th, 1826, 26 years after his presidency ended. Adams was not only a farmer, but he was a lawyer of great ability and a fiery and articulate advocate for independence. In January 1776, as McCullough so dramatically captured him, he was embarking for the third time on a hazardous 400-mile journey to Philadelphia as a delegate to the Third Continental Congress. A trip that would take at least 2 weeks, probably more, given the condition of the roads and Adams' reluctance to ride on the Sabbath. Adams was a man of faith. McCullough points out that as a delegate from Massachusetts to the First and Second Continental Congresses, Adams had emerged as one of the most sensible and forcible figures in the whole patriot cause. Well, and of course, the Crown had responded to the desperate pleas of the First and Second Continental Congresses by attacking the colonists' ships and ports, burning towns such as Charleston, Falmouth, Norfolk, enlisting slaves and Indians to fight against the colonists and contracting with German mercenaries, the dreaded Hessians, to help reestablish its authority in North America. Now in January 1776, as Adams embarked for Philadelphia, Washington informed John Hancock, President of the Continental Congress, that hardly 5,000 men were fit for duty. Promises of men, muskets, powder, and urgently needed supplies had never materialized. Firewood was needed. As if this weren't enough, smallpox had broken out and had spread throughout Boston. Columns of the ill-clad, starving poor had come pouring out of Boston into the American lines, many of them sick and in desperate need of shelter. As Adams set out on his winter's journey to the Third Continental Congress in Philadelphia, the first copies of Thomas Paine's Common Sense appeared and created a sensation throughout the colonies. There was no going back, the pamphlet argued. American freedom could never be secure under the British Crown, largely as a result of the influence of Paine's book, which was read by a sizable percentage of the populace, rather extraordinary percentage. Towns and counties at long last began passing resolutions, instructing their elected representatives to work for independence. The crisis had now reached desperate proportions. So it was that in the spring of 1776, a committee of 5 men was finally appointed by the Continental Congress, almost as an act of desperation, to draft a document declaring independence. The prime movers in that document, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. Benjamin Franklin was on the committee, but he was ill at the time from the effects of a recent trip to Canada. Apparently was not often in attendance. Adams' time was at hand, but so also was Thomas Jefferson's. The contributions of the two of them to the document were critical. Now, Jefferson and Adams were a strange pair, an odd couple, really. The contrast between them was marked. Jefferson was taller and rather thin. Adams was shorter and rather plump. Jefferson was a wealthy aristocrat. Adams was from a family of farmers. Jefferson inherited great wealth from his father. He inherited aristocracy from his mother, Virginia Randolph. His land holdings in Albemarle County, Virginia, exceeded 5,000 acres, whereas Adams, a New England Yankee, socialized with his neighbors in Braintree. Jefferson was more remote and removed himself to a mountaintop to build a palatial country mansion of his own design in the manner of the 16th century Italian architect Andrea Palladio. Monticello, he called it. Monticello means little mountain in Italian. Adams was very vocal. Jefferson was not. He preferred writing. In fact, during Jefferson's presidency, he made only 2 speeches, his 2 inaugural addresses, no others. Tobacco planters like Jefferson were becoming increasingly dependent not only upon slaves, but upon money borrowed from English creditors against future crops. Whereas Adams remained frugal and quite solvent to the day he died, Jefferson was a spendthrift and died impoverished, leaving his heirs not only the little mountain of Monticello, but a great mountain of debt as well. He even left disputes as to who some of his progeny were. Jefferson, it seems, sowed a mess of wild oats, as recent DNA tests appear to have proven. It would be unthinkable that any such questions of lineage could be raised about Adams' legatees. Now, despite Jefferson increasing in dependence on his English creditors, in the spring of 1776, Jefferson had seen enough. His commitment to independence was no less than that of Adams. Both were irrevocably bound to the cause of independence. Both were certain that we were at a crossroads at our history, and both were emphatically wished to play a significant role in shaping the direction it took. Jefferson admired Adams as a clear and dynamic thinker. He was his mentor. They spent considerable time together, but as we'll see, theirs was a love-hate relationship that lasted until the day both were destined to die. You all probably know this, July 4th, 1826, 50 years exactly to the day after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, one of those curious ironies of history. Well, why then was Jefferson rather than Adams chosen to draft the document? As a result of that fateful decision, it's Jefferson, not Adams, who appears on Mount Rushmore. There's a monument in Washington, marvelous monument, devoted to Jefferson, none to Adams. No one's quite sure why Jefferson was chosen. There are many versions. Although he was not very vocal, Jefferson had a highly developed writing style. Perhaps Adams was swayed by this in deferring to the younger, quieter man. No one knows for certain. What is more significant to me is that Jefferson, a Virginian, in drafting the Declaration of Independence, drew heavily not only upon Enlightenment thinking of John Locke, with which Adams was also familiar, but also upon the unique contribution of Virginian George Mason. Mason was the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. The contribution of Locke was important, but for me, the influence of George Mason on the Declaration was paramount. A word then about Locke and Mason. John Locke was one of the most influential thinkers of the Enlightenment. Locke regarded natural law and moral science as analogous to axioms in geometry. His trust in nature was sentimental, but it was quite unwarranted by anything that science or philosophy knew about in an empirical way. But this habit of ascribing such things as morality to natural law as if it were axiomatic ran right across the history of political and economic theory of the 18th century. And Jefferson expresses this Enlightenment thinking in the very first sentence of the Declaration of Independence. It goes like this: when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Note the entitlement springs from the laws of nature. Natural law, according to Locke and Jefferson, entitles us to a separate and equal station. This must be so, argued Locke and Jefferson, from empirical evidence. After all, this was the age of reason. It was really, in many respects, an era of philosophical ambiguity. Locke, a leading philosopher of the Enlightenment in his work Human Understanding, devoted substantial attention to showing that no idea is innate. That is, no idea is so fundamental that belief in it is warranted apart from empirical evidence. Let me give you one important example, one fraught with implications for our founders. Locke conceived of property not as a right created by society, but as something that each person brings to society, just as he brings to society the physical energy of his body. This, claimed Locke, was clear from empirical evidence. And then Locke, without missing a beat, made a quantum leap from his so-called empiricism to this. He proposed that all human rights are on the same lines as property. That is to say, they're attributes of the individual person, but they're born within him, innate. Like property, the individual brings them to society, and hence they are indefeasible claims by the individual upon society and government. So, Locke contends, human rights such as freedom, just like property rights, are a law of nature and can never be justly put aside, since society itself exists to protect them. This is typical of Enlightenment thinking. George Mason of Virginia, however, as we shall see, added a very significant American twist to these European Enlightenment concepts of rights and property. Now, why go into this highly theoretical discussion? Some of your eyes may be glazing by this time. Well, judge for yourself. Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin are all studied and absorbed Locke. And it was from Locke and from the Virginia Bill of Rights, drafted by George Mason, with which both Jefferson and Adams were also intimately familiar, that Jefferson crafted and Adams ratified the most renowned phrases of the Declaration, recited today by school children and political leaders alike as a mantra. You probably know these phrases by heart. Martin Luther King, for example, repeated them almost as American karma from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in his famous I Have a Dream speech. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The bulk of the rest of the Declaration of Independence goes on to excoriate King George, and particularly his Parliament, for corrupting the role of government. The role of government, it contends, should be to secure these rights, not to tyrannize its subjects. And almost the entire body of the remainder of the document is devoted to a recitation of a litany of grievances against the king and against the Parliament. Now, some eminent historians, very eminent historians, have concluded that this list of grievances is really what our Declaration of Independence is all about. Just a rehash of a litany of petitions of the First and Second Continental Congresses, economic and other grievances. But I strongly disagree. And to understand my contempt for this thinking, you must understand the thinking of George Mason. Now, who was this George Mason? Mason has been described as a scholar and statesman steeped in the history and philosophy of British liberties, rights, and common law. A biography of Mason tells us that Mason had become convinced in his study of British constitutional history that there was a kind of natural law at work in this world. That, if made a matter of practice, would surely put an end to the bondage of the past. So far, Mason is engaged in typical Lockean Enlightenment thinking. Novak, however, goes on to describe how for Mason, each human being has been endowed by his Creator with an inalienable capacity for reflecting and choosing. Each human being has an internal, self-determining principle. This unique capacity of human nature evokes awe, wonder, and respect. It is not too much to speak of man's interior space as sacred. And now comes the uniquely American key to the thinking of Mason. For Mason's declaration opens with a strong statement. All men are by nature free and have certain basic rights that cannot be tampered with, including the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Protecting these is the true end of government. Let me repeat the operative words here. Liberty with the means of acquiring property and pursuing happiness. What's happened here then to the theories of Locke regarding natural law and property? There's a subtle, very significant distinction between the British Enlightenment of Locke and the totally American Enlightenment of Mason. It is this. As Novak astutely observes, Mason goes beyond Locke's stress on the mere ownership of property as a right of nature to define and emphasize a distinctively American experience, the experience and right not only of possessing but of acquiring property, especially on the part of those not well born. In this land of opportunity, the unfolding of this capacity was becoming a powerful reality. In England, striated by a rigid caste system, it was not. So Mason defined the American drive and yearning for liberty, but he also defined a uniquely American human spirit. This spirit is no doubt the reason that most, if not all of us, are here today, somewhere in that genealogy of ours, that genealogy that many of us are desperately searching to find these days. In immigration and naturalization records, 100 and 150-year-old ships manifests, census records, we will almost with certainty find ancestors of ours, seeking to better their human condition, uprooting themselves and coming to this unknown distant shore, confident that given freedom and a chance, they could achieve and better their condition. And that is the unique American quality that Mason found. It's a quality that Locke and the European Enlightenment never found. And it's right there, built into our Declaration of Independence. There's even more to George Mason. In his recent book, On Two Wings, theologian Michael Novak points out there's no doubt that in its emphasis on the first of all rights, the right of liberty of conscience, the right which a man experiences in the presence of the Almighty, that Mason's declaration achieves its deepest originality. The American experience begins in a profound respect for the space not occupied by an established church, but in the inviolable and inalienable arena of the decision-making of the individual before God. As such, according to Mason, the experience leads beyond the virtue of tolerance to a more profound virtue. As President George Washington was to point out to the Hebrew congregation of Newport in a very famous letter to them written in 1790, welcoming them into the just-formed American Republic, as God respects every individual conscience, so must we. It is no doubt this quality, coupled with the disastrous experience with state religions in Europe, that led the Founding Fathers, although men of faith, to nevertheless forcefully resist the establishment of a state religion here. And it is this quality, no doubt, that enabled our revolutionary movement to enlist and maintain within its ranks both devotees of institutional religion and opponents of institutional religion, such as Tom Paine. Novak goes on to point out that in much of its phrasing, Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights anticipates the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. This fact helps verify Jefferson's confession that his own declaration was not original, but stated the common sense of the matter as it was widely understood in the colonies. David McCullough discovered that Adams, too, was well versed in these sources. And though given his prominence in the independence movement, Adams could undoubtedly have chosen to draft the Declaration of Independence, his decision to defer to Jefferson proved a wise choice. What made Jefferson's work surpassing was, of course, its grace and its eloquence of expression. But the Mason image of man, the Mason characterization of the sacredness of human striving to better one's condition, and the Mason expression of the right to liberty of conscience, all of which found their way into the document. All of this was also the meat and sinew of John Adams, the man whose hands were accustomed to cutting his own hay, splitting his own firewood, a man who traveled 400 miles through punishing weather to be there at the founding. And these ideals were just as paramount to Jefferson, the wealthy aristocrat planter from the mountaintop of Virginia, who was the beneficiary of the greatness of his countryman, George Mason, as are we all. Mason's biographer points out that the dark contradiction of slavery did not conform to the bright new world Mason was conceiving, and it already worried Mason deeply as a nightmare in the making. As we know, this issue was compromised in the Constitution in order to enable the coalescence of a fragile union of states. And we only really began a solution to the problem 75 years later at a cost of 1 million American dead and wounded. Well, must there be a religious foundation for the ideals of freedom that Jefferson and Adams wrote in the Declaration? Certainly not an institutional religious foundation, for our founders were unalterably opposed to state religion. But we must by this time sense that the sole foundation of our democracy is not merely the Enlightenment belief in natural law. Clearly that was a factor, a major factor to many. But just as clearly, to many, that was not the only factor. Adams and Jefferson were both men of faith. Both were intimately familiar with the Old Testament. Both felt deeply the pronouncement in Genesis that we're all created in the image of God. To the framers of the Declaration, the prime movers in that document, there was more involved than a mere revolt against the Tea Acts, the Stamp Act, the Townsend Act. Although admittedly the First and Second Continental Congresses had focused on this. I am convinced, as is Novak, that for many of our founding fathers, something much deeper emerged from that committee. There was a spark of the divine there. To that committee of five, grounded as they all were in the Old Testament, as well as Enlightenment thinking of natural law, each human soul has meaning, worth, dignity, and the right to freedom of conscience, the right to select, the right to choose. For all of the historical problems we've endured in our quest to retain that freedom, and we'll explore many in depth in these sessions, and for all of the cynicism, and for all of the contempt that we may feel from time to time during this course for the characteristics that have brought freedom to the edge, time and again in our country, we must never lose sight of the fact that these extraordinary concepts were there at the founding. Novak points out in the poignant first chapter of his book On Two Wings that Americans took from the Hebrew Bible its appeal to the imperishable dignity of each person with uncommon hope and optimism, erecting on it with the help of Locke and others a new structure of rights and covenants. The depths of this metaphysical background gave them unusual moral strength, writes Novak. Any recounting of the story of the American polity that cuts off this metaphysical background will not fly. So our Declaration of Independence contains much, much more than a mere miscellany of economic and other grievances against King George. It's a pronouncement that states as emphatically as possible that liberty of conscience is an inherent right of man because each individual soul has dignity. And whether God-given or not, or derived from natural law, has a right to strive to better one's condition. And in support of this declaration, the signers ended with this: with a firm reliance on divine providence, we mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Americans fought for these ideals, and Americans died for these ideals. And thus the years of the founders, 1775 and 1776, were in many ways the best of times. And in this sense, at least, in the phraseology of Dickens, it was an epic of belief, not an epic of incredulity. Well, so much for the philosophic foundations of our freedom. What then were the structural foundations? The Constitution was formed years later and finally emerged in 1789, the Bill of Rights in 1791. Now, if the 1770s was a decade of belief in the virtue of man and the corruptibility of government, 1780s was a decade which in a sense saw these values reversed. The decade that eventually brought us our Constitution was a decade in which government was now seen as a virtue, something required to rein in the baser instincts in man. It was also an era in which the struggle between liberty and the need for order was illuminated. This is a struggle which recurs time and again in our history, and we'll explore this struggle throughout the remainder of our session. The quality of individualism, so eloquently described by Mason, was rapidly becoming an attribute defining the American character. Still is. But it was also proving a two-edged sword. For this quality was also preventing the unification of the disparate states into a coherent, functioning whole. As Alexis de Tocqueville, an astute observer of American life, so eloquently described in the 1830s, the self-reliance and the self-interest that were so inherent a part of our economic life came in conflict with the mutual bonds required to establish community. And the contrary demands of freedom and the constraints necessary to preserve order began to emerge, offering, as they were, corresponding polar opposites, opposite threats, tyranny and anarchy. In the world following the Revolution, therefore, there emerged a much more cynical view of the nature of man. Evidence of this can be found in the Federalist Papers, particularly Federalist 51, and pronouncements by George Washington himself. The Federalist Papers, you'll remember, were a series of newspaper articles in 1787 and 1788, written by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison to promote ratification of the Constitution. In Federalist 51, Madison, or perhaps Hamilton, we're not sure which, points out that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And then Federalist 51 wisely points out, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place to control itself. And then wisely, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. In a nutshell, that's the key to the doctrine of separation of powers. And men are not angels. To make a government work and not run amok, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Listen to these lines written by George Washington in a letter to John Jay, dated August 1, 1786, echoing these sentiments. We have probably had too good an opinion of human nature in forming our confederation. Experience has taught us that men will not adopt and carry into execution measures best calculated for their own good without the intervention of coercive power. The state of our Union, when we finally got around to appointing a committee to draft a Constitution, was a very sorry one indeed. Perhaps Washington was right. Perhaps we had too good an opinion of human nature. Our government was a paper tiger. We faced almost insurmountable challenges resulting in great part from the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. What challenges? Well, the British refused to withdraw from their outposts in the Great Lakes, and the Spanish closed the mouth of the Mississippi to commerce. Armed Indians encouraged by Britain and Spain attacked helpless frontier settlements, and Barbary pirates preyed unopposed on American merchant shipping. We had virtually no army, and we had no navy. In short, we were possibly on the brink of extinction, really. And our governmental institutions were hardly organized to cope with these threats. The Articles of Confederation had rendered the central government virtually powerless. So what then were these Articles of Confederation? Well, one thing they were not was a constitution. Under the Articles, all meaningful power resided in the individual states. The central government consisted only of a unicameral, one house, Congress. There was no chief executive, no judicial branch. All law enforcement was left to the states. There was no central court to handle disputes between citizens of different states. No power to tax, no power to raise an army. Congress could only request, not demand, that states supply troops. This had almost been our undoing during the Revolutionary War. It was Washington's continuous nightmare. But following the defeat of Cornwallis at Yorktown, the militias had gone home. The French fleet, which had rescued us at Yorktown, was gone. French were in fact hostile. Federal government was helpless. Threats were looming. Although Congress could issue currency under the Articles, it had no power to prevent states from issuing their own. And issue what they did in droves. The weaknesses of some of these currencies and the various state instruments used to pay the state militias led to many serious problems. They left numerous veterans of the Revolution totally impoverished, driven to selling their IOUs for Revolutionary War service for less than 10 cents on the dollar. As we'll see next week, this became a factor in a major sex scandal involving Alexander Hamilton, which in turn influenced the passage of the Alien Sedition Acts. The Articles of Confederation, then, more of a loose compact than a document of government, and it seems incredible looking back that we've actually fought a Revolutionary War with nothing more substantial or binding than this. You would think that given this chaotic state of our government and the perilous state of our nation in 1784, there would be a commanding movement afoot to develop a constitution to replace this loose and ineffectual federation. Well, there wasn't. Instead, the genesis of the Constitution happened like this, almost by accident. In 1786, 5 states sent delegates to a convention in Annapolis, Maryland, to discuss commercial relations among the states, not to develop a constitution. The Annapolis Convention, frustrated in its work for lack of a definitive governing document, finally gave up and petitioned Congress for a conference to remove the weaknesses of the Articles. Now, Congress reluctantly yielded, finally called a convention in Philadelphia for the sole purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation, not for forming a constitution. This convention, however, ultimately did lead to the framing of a constitution through the untiring efforts, wisdom, and skill of a very few young men. James Madison, often called the founder of the Constitution, was 33 years old. Alexander Hamilton, 30 years old. But he was rapidly emerging as a powerful advocate for the propertied interest in strong central government, and he was on his way to becoming one of the most prominent Federalists of his era. Benjamin Franklin was the elder in attendance, lent his prestige, but apparently said little, and reportedly often slept during the constitutional debates. Adams and Jefferson were absent. They were in Europe, London and Paris, respectively, as our ambassadors. George Washington apparently presided in a fair manner, but added little of substance to the document that emerged. Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay, the authors of the Federalist Papers, these were the prime movers here. But what then emerged? There were 3 essential competing theories of government that Madison was wrestling with. And the question was how to integrate them. Theory 1, monarchy. They knew a lot about monarchy. Monarchs were strong. They provided order, authority, energy. But left alone, monarchy became tyranny. They'd had enough experience with that. Theory 2, aristocracy. Aristocrats were meant to provide wisdom and counsel. The danger in aristocracy as a form of government was faction and conspiracy. Theory 3, democracy. The democracy of the Greek and Roman polity was meant to represent honesty and goodness. The danger it posed was the anarchy and the chaos of the guillotine, as the contemporary French learned to their regret in 1789 and the years that followed. Now, all three of these elements were blended into our Constitution in a unique way. Monarchy into the executive branch, aristocracy into the judicial branch, and democracy into the legislative branch, each with its own powers, each with its own limitations. Ambition was being made to counteract ambition. Our tendency to deviate from this careful balance of powers prescribed in the Constitution, which often occurs in times of national stress, crisis, or when xenophobia in one form or another is in the ascendancy, has been a significant factor in bringing freedom to the edge time and again in our history. Well, how then did Madison integrate these theories? He integrated them by using the virtues of each and discarding the vices of each. This system was originally devised in one form or another in Greece and Rome. It's not totally new. And it was described as well by the French philosopher Montesquieu in the Spirit of the Laws. But the unique way in which the balance of powers was intricately woven into the fabric of our Constitution is considered by many to be an act of genius. It's held up remarkably for over 2 centuries. Precisely as described in Federalist 51, each unit of government had a distinct task, either to make or execute or interpret the laws. No member of the legislative, executive, or judicial branches may hold office in either of the other two. This distinguishes our separation of powers, of course, from that in Britain. In Britain, as you know, cabinet officers are often drawn from the House of Commons, the House of Lords. But although our three functions are separated, the lines begin to blur. And here's how. Although all of our legislative powers are vested in Congress, Congress may nonetheless vest in executive officers the power to make necessary rules and regulations to enforce the law. These rules and regulations now fill libraries, are both legislative and in some respects judicial in other respects. They cross the strict lines of separation. When used to excess or imprudently or by the wrong men, this delegation of rulemaking power can quickly lead to an imbalance of power in favor of the executive branch or otherwise in the legislative branch. Of course, the devil here is in the details. In the Alien and Sedition Acts, the delegation of judicial authority to the executive was a significant factor in empowering the executive, in consort with a compliant judiciary, to vitiate the First Amendment a mere 7 years after its enactment. And closer to the present, as late as November 2001, the alleged usurpation by the executive, by executive regulations, of the congressional power to legislate in connection with national security has become a major constitutional battleground since September 11th, especially in connection with the executive order of November 13th, 2001, which authorized the indefinite detention of aliens incommunicado and the establishment of military tribunals. Moreover, a number of executive regulations, particularly by the Justice Department and the INS, adopted on the basis of national security, which effectively constitute the executive branch, both judge, jury, prosecutor, and jailer, particularly with regard to non-citizens, are currently being challenged in the courts on constitutional grounds. This is all playing out as we speak. Now, this is not a course in constitutional law, but here very briefly are some of the checks and balances that were built into this constitutional system. Article 1 of the Constitution deals exclusively with Congress, its powers and limitations. This article takes up almost 1/2 of the entire original Constitution. Why? Remember, the colonists had only a unicameral legislature under the Articles of Confederation. That's what they knew. No executive, no president, no judiciary. So concentration in the Constitution was naturally on that branch of government with which they were most familiar. Congress was granted a number of critical powers. Significantly, in Article 1, Section 8, Congress is granted all war powers, including the power to declare war, to raise and support armies, call out the militias, suppress insurrections, repel invasions. The executive is nowhere mentioned in this regard in Article 1. And in Article 2, the President is appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Services when called into service. Well, what power is actually vested in the executive as commander-in-chief in this regard is nowhere mentioned. Does he have the right in wartime, for example, to suspend the right of habeas corpus or to deny it to a designated underclass without congressional sanction? Or has this right been reserved to Congress? For in Article 1, Section 9, dealing with congressional, not executive power, almost out of the blue comes a reference to habeas corpus and to a critical limitation on the power to suspend it. Section short, succinct, only 26 words. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when, in the cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. It's notable that habeas corpus is the only right dealt with in the body of the original Constitution. What then is habeas corpus? Well, briefly, habeas corpus is the name given to a variety of writs issued by a court directing one who holds another in his custody to bring such party before a court or judge. Perhaps the most important of these writs is that employed to correct violations of personal liberty by directing judicial inquiry into the legality of the detention. The writ actually predates the Magna Carta. The writ was deemed so fundamental, so vital, that it was not even specifically spelled out in the original Constitution, as were the rights in the first 10 amendments. Its existence as a basic right was simply assumed. The Constitution seems to be saying, why, of course, everyone knows the right of habeas corpus exists. Thus, the Constitution need only refer to the exceptions to the rule, i.e., that it may be suspended only when, in times of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. Unfortunately, by whom it may be suspended is not spelled out. And therein lies the nexus of one of the problems we'll be dealing with next week, namely the executive suspension of this writ by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. Whether and to what extent the executive branch, without legislative consent, can suspend this paramount right has been a source of controversy as early as the Civil War in 1861 and as late as the executive order of the Bush administration regarding military tribunals issued November 13, 2001, without involving Congress. Article 1, Section 5 provides that each House of Congress may determine the rules of its proceedings and may punish its members for disorderly behavior. Seems innocuous. Each House of Congress may determine the rules of its proceedings. This section was in part responsible for the rise of Joseph McCarthy in the late 40s and the early 50s by authorizing the investigative function of senatorial committees in connection with the exploration of legislative alternatives, a rule. Was also responsible for his censure and thus his undoing during one of the most frightening periods in modern times. It was also the basis of the enabling legislation establishing the House Committee on Un-American Activities, the infamous HUAC Committee, under Martin Dies in 1938, which later in the 40s launched the meteoric rise of Richard Milhouse Nixon. Again, all of this flows, at least in part, from a blur in the strict check on the legislative branch as originally envisioned by the framers, which results from the adoption of rules and regulations embellishing basic constitutional powers. But what other checks were built in here? Well, for one, neither branch of Congress can legislate without the other. We all know that. The president's veto power is a further restraint on Congress. The president's veto can in turn be overturned by a 2/3 vote of each House of Congress. Ambition is being made to counteract ambition. But the legislative branch was given a further and perhaps final trump as a check on the president, for it can remove him or her from office through impeachment, a power which was mercifully exercised to end the crisis in our freedom through which we all suffered during the national nightmare of Watergate. In most respects, Congress still operates according to its original constitutional format, but its power was further circumscribed by the Bill of Rights, which starts out, and this is the preamble, Congress shall make no law respecting. This is the preamble of the First Amendment, safeguarding many of our fundamental liberties, such as freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, redress, so forth. Article 2, which established the executive branch, provides the president's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. But the president's power in this regard is checked, at least in theory, by Congress, which is given all war powers. We see drama in this section being played out as we speak, as Bush seeks congressional approval of his proposed Iraq action. The office of the executive has grown exponentially since 1789. George Washington and John Adams had but a few clerks. The current executive staff numbers in the millions. And with its expansion has come an expansion of function. This factor, together with the innumerable regulations which transcend branch function, which cross the lines, as originally envisioned by the framers, has often been the source of tension between the executive and Congress. The judicial branch of government, which is established in Article 3, provides for life tenure of federal judges, which is supposed to free them from the shackles of politicians. They are no longer beholden to the political parties once they are appointed to the bench. I think I know somebody called Al Gore who might challenge this statement. Although a number of judicial powers are spelled out in the section, the Supreme Court, most important power, judicial review, is not even alluded to. Amazing fact. This vital power, it's become a major element in our balance of power, was established, as most of you must know, without notice by judicial fiat in Chief Justice Marshall's opinion in the case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803. In constitutional terms, perhaps, the most important value of judicial review is to protect the written Constitution from major alteration except as specified in the amending process. But the extraordinary power of judicial review will soon become apparent as we consider the Supreme Court's view next week of executive authority in time of national emergency in the Civil War, in the cases of Ex parte Merriman and Ex parte Milligan. We'll see this authority again in full blossom when we consider the court's review of the trial of Japanese General Yamashita and in the Quirin case. In Quirin, the court reviewed the constitutionality of President Roosevelt's action in trying the Nazi saboteurs who landed in Long Island and in Florida in 1943 by military tribunal rather than a civil court. But in practice, as opposed to theory, has the judiciary really acted as a significant check on the executive during crisis times? We'll consider this issue next week. Now, most Americans are unaware that with the exception of habeas corpus, the original Constitution did not address protection of our individual rights at all. Amazing fact. As a result, it almost failed to be ratified. Virginia House of Burgesses didn't approve precisely because it lacked a Bill of Rights. Virginia Convention was finally able to ratify the Constitution by a slim majority only after James Madison pledged as a matter of honor he would lead a concerted effort to supplement the Constitution with amendments guaranteeing citizens' rights, privileges, and immunities. Well, 10 such amendments were approved and were ratified within 2 years and 3 months, our Bill of Rights. The First Amendment alone guarantees most of our basic freedoms, including freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, to petition the government for redress of grievances. As we shall soon see, freedom of speech and press were seriously challenged immediately and almost destroyed entirely by the passage only 7 years later of the Alien Sedition Acts. The right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures proclaimed in the Fourth Amendment. The limits of this were recently expanded by Congress because of national security concerns in the USA Patriots Act, enacted last fall. The constitutionality of many of its provisions, especially those involving privacy, expanded surveillance, the ability of the Justice Department to incarcerate and detain non-citizens for a variety of reasons involving national security, are now being tested in the courts. Perhaps the most important human right, the right of habeas corpus, which is already in the Constitution, was amplified, however, by the Fifth, Sixth, and later by the 14th Amendments. These provided numerous safeguards, including not only the well-known Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, but numerous safeguards against deprivation of life, liberty, and property without due process of law, and protections against double jeopardy. But are these Fifth, Sixth, and 14th Amendment rights, as well as habeas corpus, available to aliens? Does the Constitution permit us to arbitrarily create an underclass to whom they do not apply, even in times of national crisis? As I wrote the first draft of the session not long after September 11th, Congress was debating proposals by the Attorney General to combat terrorism to virtually abolish habeas corpus, as well as these Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights for a designated underclass, namely all aliens under the USA Patriots Act, over 18 million of them. Attorney General Ashcroft proposed holding aliens suspected of terrorism or of aiding and abetting terrorism without bail, perhaps indefinitely, and not bringing them to trial until investigations can be completed. Although in the USA Patriots Act, passed in October 2001, Congress greatly expanded the executive's investigative powers, it nonetheless carefully circumscribed the executive's rights of detention. It's perhaps part of the greatness of our country and a characteristic that defines us, that in a time of justifiable paranoia over terrorists in our midst, where our very survival is at stake, Congress, in debating the USA Patriots Act last fall, under severe pressure from the administration, nonetheless was debating the rights of suspected terrorists and saboteurs, those who would destroy our free society. But congressional action on this was soon challenged by executive decree, as well as by subsequent regulations of the executive branch. These are all currently the subject of litigation, and that litigation is proliferating. We'll have to watch it as it goes forward. There are many arguments on both sides. Later, we'll examine the limitation of aliens' rights and the expansion of executive powers by executive order of November 13, 2001. There are many instances in our history involving the abridgment of rights during a time of national stress. We shall, throughout this course, examine examples of such instances and of the stress placed on freedom by the needs of order, perceived and real during such times. Again, as I pointed out at the start, and I must emphasize that, there are no absolutes here, no simplistic solutions, no panaceas. My intention here is merely to explore with you numerous aspects of our philosophical, structural, and historical background in these areas, in the hope that this exploration will be of assistance to you as you consider your own approach to these complex and often conflicting issues of freedom and order. So our freedoms were conceived by the framers of the Declaration out of a deep and abiding faith in the dignity of man. But they were crafted into an institution of government by the framers of the Constitution out of a pragmatic recognition of man's ignoble propensities. Men are not angels. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Well, how then have we survived within this framework that we were given? Next week, xenophobia, crisis, and the dangerous imbalance of power, as we explore the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798 and the suspension of habeas corpus by President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War in 1861. Thank you.